of Columbia, a research and writing specialist with the Federal Defender Office, and an assistant defender with the State Appellate Defender Office in Detroit. She began her legal career as a law clerk to the Honorable Julian Abel Cook, Jr. in the U.S. District Court in the Eastern District of Michigan. She has served as an adjunct professor at Grand Rapids Community College. She garnered the death penalty litigation experience as an extern with the Alabama Capital Resource Center. She conducted research, interviewed inmates, their relatives, and former jurors, combined statistic on racial composition of juries, helped prepare an argument before the U.S. Supreme Court, and drafted racial justice legislation for the state of Alabama. Professor Brame started the Access of Justice Clinic at the Grand Rapids campus in 2006 and currently runs the West Michigan Public Defender Clinic. She also teaches elective constitutional law courses. She's a very busy woman, and if you want to catch up with her, good luck. It gives me great privilege to introduce her to be our speaker today.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I always appreciate when people read my bio. Like I get tired just listening to it. So I'm like, oh, that's why I'm so tired. It's truly, it's a pleasure to be here today. I love the words from one of the previous speakers. I love that I get to be here today, right? So I was given the option of recording a presentation and I was all ready to do that. And then at the last minute, we decided, well, you know what, you could just join us on Saturday morning. And I said, okay, well, I would love to do that because I would love to get as close to in-person, right, as we can get. And these days, this is as close to in-person as we get. So hopefully I will get through the presentation without any interruptions on my end. If you saw my camera go blank just briefly a few minutes ago, it was because the puppy had found me and had gotten away from my daughter. So, you know, these days when we're living at work, I know that it could be a challenge to stay focused on on tasks. So I'm going to certainly try to do that. But again, I just already just listening in, I love this group of women. I love what you all are doing. I love your mission. I love that there are 133 of you gathered on a Saturday morning, right, to put faith, hope, and love in action and have asked me here today. So you know, to figure out where to start, I love also the theme of thinking outside the box, right? Of conspiring or thinking together to kind of go beyond the norm, right? To go beyond where we've been to try to get to a better place. And so I want to talk a little bit this morning about the pipeline to prison, or the school to prison pipeline that's plaguing so many of our young people, our boys and girls. And I appreciate the opportunity to encourage you all to think outside the box. And so I'm going to spend just a few minutes this morning talking about that box, right? Talking about the box that our young people are being placed in and the issues, you know, that are facing them as they try to seek education and better themselves in their community. So I'm going to try to share my screen. We'll see technology. I could do this, and I think so. Let's see. All right. Hopefully you all can see my screen. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So, and again, these are just notes for me, again, to try to stay on point and on task. So this morning, I just, again, want to take a few minutes to challenge our assumptions, right, and change the paradigm a little bit when we're talking about education, and particularly the education of young Black and brown boys and girls. So as you all know, let me change my view so I can make sure I can see things. So as you all know, again, this seems like a really thoughtful and deliberate body of women. So I'm sure that you all know that there is a recurring and prevalent problem of overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, right? So that, so we know that African Americans are overrepresented in our prisons. So even we comprise about 13% of the US population, we comprise about 40% of the prison population. So again, you know, this box that we talk about, you might hear a common pushback to that is that, well, it just so happens that, more African Americans commit crimes, or, if, the inner cities are kind of plagued with violence, and that's why, there's so many people in prison. And so that's the paradigm that I want to kind of, begin to chip away at, so that we don't just stop right at that next at that pushback, but then we ask why. Why is it, if it's the case that more African Americans are charged with and convicted of crimes and placed in prison? Why is that? What's happening, right? So what accounts for such a significant disparity? Okay, so it can't just be that more of us are committing crimes, right? And the truth or falsity of that is a subject of a whole nother conversation. But when we think about why we're so overrepresented in our nation's prisons, there are several underlying reasons that go all the way back to centuries of demonization of African Americans. And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. Disparate sentencing, African Americans being given longer sentences for similar conduct. When I first began practicing law in the 90s, one of the big issues was crack versus powder cocaine, and people convicted of possession and distribution of crack cocaine were sentenced much more harshly than those convicted of cocaine related crimes because, right, crack was so much worse, et cetera. And of course that impacted inner city communities because back then, right, crack was more prevalent in inner city communities, whereas powder cocaine was more prevalent in the suburbs. So things like that. Disparate policing. Okay. And of course, that's a charged issue right now. And inner city communities always struggle with the push and pull because the police are obviously a very important part of our communities and keeping us safe and serving and protecting, right? But there's also often an increased, right, an outsized police presence in inner city communities for lots of reasons. Lack of quality education, health and nutrition disparities, lack of legacy and role models, availability of employment, right? And I could go on and on. So, when I talk to my students, one of the classes that I teach is a class on race in the Supreme Court, just talking about how courts have treated issues of race over the years. And I always ask the students why they're taking the course, right? Because they don't have to. It's an elective course at our law school. And I always get a variety of answers. In one semester, a student said, I took this course because I was curious about why this is even a course, right? Like, why are we talking about this? Like, it's 2000 and whatever year it was, I was teaching a course, right? And I'm just interested in why race is still a topic, right? And one of the answers to that is, there's lots of answers to that, but one of them is that race still underlies a lot of the disparities that we see in our society, right? And until we talk about that and unpack that and figure out why, there's always going to be, right, a disparity in education, disparity in nutrition, et cetera, right? So we have to talk about the things that underlie those disparities. Okay, so, when I talk about these enduring badges of slavery or demonization of African Americans, we often think about slavery as an ancient wrong that has little relevance today, right? That was a long time ago. That's a lot of pushback that I hear, right? When we have conferences or discussions or roundtables about race, like, really, can't we just put that behind us, right? Look at you, Tracey, you're a law professor. You are a long way, right, from your great-great-great-grandmother, right, who was a slave. And that's true, and that's wonderful. I'm very proud of my family. I'm very proud of the African-American community in general and the strides that we've been able to make despite, right, despite the way that we arrived on shores hundreds of years ago. That is all wonderful. But the notion that slavery ended in 1865, right? And that the lingering effects of slavery kind of ended a long time ago, I think is a romantic one, right? So if you think that you can enslave, brutally transport people to a land with which they are absolutely unfamiliar, and, brutalize them and enslave them for 400 years, and then in just 100 years or so, right, say, okay, you guys are good now, right? To me, it's kind of a romantic notion. And again, until we kind of deal with that, I think we're going to continue to see these enduring badges of slavery. So if you look, kind of at a timeline, slavery officially ended in 1865, right? With the Emancipation Proclamation, end of the Civil War, et cetera. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? 3 amendments that specifically, right, tried to embed the rights of newly freed Africans into our Constitution. Those were enacted in 1868. 13th Amendment, right, said no more slavery. 14th Amendment says that there's a right to equal protection under law and due process. And the 15th Amendment talks about the fact that voting rights cannot be inhibited on the basis of race. That happened in 1868. Jim Crow segregation took root and held on until the late 1960s. Okay, so my parents were born in the late 40s and 1950. So in their lifetime, Jim Crow was alive and well, just a generation before me. Right, my in-laws went to segregated schools in the South. Brown versus Board of Education, a seminal case, right, that desegregated the school systems. It's not even 100 years old yet. Right, it was 1954. Loving versus Virginia was out, which banned laws that outlawed, right, interracial marriage. That was decided in 1967. In fact, the young man who represented the couple in that case just passed away just recently. I have friends, right, whose parents married, you know what I mean, right around that time because of the decision, and they were able to do so because of the decision in Loving versus Virginia. So just a generation before me. Walthagaye, I had the pleasure when I was a law student to work with Bryan Stevenson, and I'm sure by now you've all heard his name. When I worked with him, he was 5 years out of law school, and he was a young attorney who decided to spend his time and talents representing death row inmates in Alabama. And I had the privilege of working with him as a young law student. And I got to his office on the heels of, if you've seen the movie Just Mercy or read the book Just Mercy, the protagonist in that movie and book along with Bryan is Walter McMillan, his wrongfully convicted client. And I had the pleasure of meeting Walter when I worked with Bryan in the mid 90s. And Walter McMillan was wrongfully convicted on capital murder charges in the 1980s and was not exonerated until the 1990s, right? He was convicted of raping and killing a white woman in Alabama in the 1980s and wasn't freed until the 1990s. And then finally, right, Trayvon Martin was killed and the shooter found not guilty just in 2012, right? So does that still seem like so long ago? And we could talk about George Floyd and all the things. I haven't even gotten to 2020, right? Because that could be the beginning and end of my presentation if I started listing, you know, all of the enduring badges of slavery. So early America's depictions of African Americans laid a foundation that has been difficult to overcome, right? So when we, you know, at the time that slavery ended, it's not as though we came together as a country and had a round table and just decided, you know what, we think it's about time to end slavery. And we all kind of peacefully come to this together. No, it was a hard fought battle in which millions of lives were lost and in which, right, the Confederacy went down fighting, literally went down fighting, right? Fighting for lots of things, but importantly, fighting for their right to continue their way of life, which was heavily dependent on slaves. Okay, so, and there were millions of white people in the South who were rendered homeless, jobless, who were killed, et cetera, right, in the name of freeing slaves. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that the aftermath wasn't so easy, right? It wasn't as though we had a kumbaya moment afterward and, you know, they welcomed all of the newly free Africans into the American society with no problems. Okay. Instead, what followed was decades of figuring out what to do, right, with these newly freed Africans. How do they fit into our society? Because maybe we can't own them anymore, but surely they can't be considered our equals. Because if you remember the whole basis of slavery, how we as a country justify slavery to ourselves. Because by the late 1700s, 1800s, again, slavery was falling out of fashion in many, you know, supposedly enlightened areas of the world. But we as Americans, particularly, right, we had just founded our country on notions of liberty and all men being created equal. And yet the very people, right, who wrote those words, right, who signed those declarations, who signed that Constitution, owned slaves. And how do we reconcile that? We reconcile that by convincing ourselves that somehow Africans were different, right? Somehow we had a right to enslave these people because they were different. They weren't quite as smart as we were, and we were really doing them a favor, right? Because they're not quite as civilized as we are, and you know they're treated, you know, they're doing better here than they would have, you know, back in their villages in Africa, and we're, you know, bringing them over to the enlightened new world, right, and helping them out. They're not quite as smart as we are, and look at the way they're built. They're built for work. They're built to serve other people. And, I say that, and it wasn't a tongue in cheek, it wasn't like now, if you say that now, it's very, very politically incorrect. Back then, there were scientific journals with whole articles, right, with supposed evidence of how and why Africans were different and therefore slavery was okay. So even our Supreme Court in 1857, okay, this is, as we're leading up to the Civil War, leading up to the end of slavery, dictated that they, meaning the enslaved Africans, have for more than a century been regarded as beings of inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So this is from the United States Supreme Court, right? The supreme law of our land, one of the most respected entities in the country, and I'd say the world, right? Dictating that enslaved Africans were so far inferior that they had no rights at all, right? Which the white man was bound to respect. So there were cases on the books back then in which slaves were killed and people weren't punished for it because the slaves were considered property, things like that. So while the law evolved, right? So one of the things we talk about in my class is the limitations of the law. So while the law itself evolved and we eventually had the Emancipation Proclamation, eventually the Constitution was amended, eventually we had a Voting Rights Act, eventually Loving versus Virginia was decided, et cetera, it's not as easy to eradicate the social impact of those views, right? In fact, if you're not careful, right, you could have a backlash because we could change the laws and then those people who aren't ready for those changes, right, can push back in ways that are, that are dangerous and lingering. Okay, so those historical views impact our prison pipeline even today. Okay, so if you imagine again, this justification for slavery that's based on the inferiority of an entire race, those lingering thoughts about the relationship between white people and Black people affects us even today. Okay, so we see it in the form of housing discrimination, white flight leading to disparate wealth and education opportunities. So even as recently, right, as end of World War II, soldiers come back, there are federal programs that help people get loans to buy houses. Black people are excluded from those programs and therefore unable to afford or buy homes, right? Creating a wealth disparity that we see that continues even today. Okay, so children of color end up living in poor communities. I'm sorry, see, this is the working at home, living at work piece of it. Children of color end up living in poor communities with substandard schools. Remembering that property taxes, right, form the basis of a lot of our school funding, right? Implicit bias and stereotypes convince whites and even some African Americans that poverty and crime are a natural part of African American culture, leading to policies that criminalize African American youth and foreshadow prison time. So from the time that they're young, right, a lot of our African American boys and girls are stereotyped in such ways that people assume things about them, right, just by looking at them. I remember so I have a son and a daughter, and my son is now a freshman in high school. And so a lot of these issues are kind of at the forefront of my mind now, particularly as I watch what's going on in our world now. And I remember when he was just a little boy, 6 years old, and everybody said, oh, he's so cute. Oh, he's just so adorable. They would pinch his cheeks, et cetera, et cetera. And I literally, as I watch his shoulders broaden and his voice deepen, right, I think to myself, are they still going to think that he's cute? Right, as he starts to get a little peach fuzz under his, lip, and again, his muscles start to form, right? Or will people revert to those stereotypes about him and assume things about where he comes from, assume things about his propensity for crime, et cetera, things that at best might infringe on his self-confidence, and at worst, could lead to his death. And so those, those are real issues that we as African American mothers think about. African-American boys are perceived as being older than they are, studies show, right? So many of our boys do not get the benefit of mere adolescence, of being kids. So studies show that if you show, side by side a picture of a young white boy and a young Black boy, the assumption is going to be that the Black boy is older, right? And more manly. and therefore more dangerous. And these, again, just go back to our prior notions, right? That, you know, that we used to separate people a long time ago. And those are the things that we have to be deliberate about. And that we have to conspire to think outside of those boxes that we've been placed in order to create real change and real paths for our young people. So how does this affect, right, school? How does this affect the little babies in preschool, right? You know, is there really a pipeline to prison that starts, you know, in preschool? And statistically, unfortunately, you know, that answer is yes. And I'm happy to say that now this issue gets more and more play, and there are very good people thinking very hard about this, thinking outside of the box about it, and trying to tackle, you know, some of these issues. But school policies, you know, implemented in the 1990s, there was a push to be tough on crime. I don't know if you guys have been watching the debates, but one of President Trump's criticisms of Vice President Biden was that he was one of the champions of the 1990s crime bill, that, you know, the big tough on crime. And there was this sense that with, you know, violence kind of spiraling out of control, that we needed new laws, that we needed to be tough on crime, that we needed to crack down, right, on crime in order, right, to eradicate it. But what that led to, in part, was a socialization of young African-American children as criminals, right? There was an infamous little clip of Hillary Clinton, you know, talking about, you know, kind of these dangerous people, you know, these criminals. And so it led to policies such as zero tolerance, suspensions, right, and police presence in our school. And again, as a policy, right? And one of my friends posted on her Facebook page, you know, this criticism of Biden. She reminded us in her post that it wasn't just Vice President Biden, right, or Secretary Clinton or President Clinton that were championing these policies. There were a lot of our pastors in the African-American community, a lot of our leaders in the African-American community, because we were trying to find ways to address crime. And that's always been, I guess, part of the nuance and part of the, you know, kind of tough things about this issue, is because people of color, particularly, but not only those living in inner cities, face threats from within and without, right? Crime is a real problem, right? And some areas, but right, so are the forces that come in and try to fix that problem. You know what I mean? And so a lot of our families are caught between a rock and a hard place. So, you know, it's not, you know, it's not a stretch to think that some of our leaders would say, oh yeah, we need to have zero tolerance, right? If we could just root out the bad ones, you know what I mean? If we could just send the criminals away, you know. And then the problem is, you know, there's a real fine line, right, between the bad ones and the ones that need our help. And of course, I would argue, you know, I don't know. I think there are this many truly bad people, right? And the vast majority of people who get into trouble are troubled people who need our help. And instead we turn them into, right, criminals. Okay, we decided that we weren't going to tolerate them at all. Okay. So for example, in Chicago schools, zero tolerance policies resulted from a jump of 21 expulsions, right, in 94, 95 to 668 just a couple of years later. So immediately, right, this new policy goes into effect, and right, never saw a 300% increase over a similar time period. Okay, so we reverted to a lock 'em up mentality to try to address this problem. But we found that there's a correlation between suspensions and contact with the criminal justice system, right? Unfortunately, it's a continuum. Once a young person is suspended, he is less likely to complete high school. She is twice as likely to be arrested while on forced leave from school. More likely to be in contact with the juvenile system, right? And experiencing school punishment before age 15 is associated with contact with the criminal justice system for boys. And again, that shouldn't be surprising, but the way we treat our kids in school is a microcosm of the way we treat them, right, in society. And if we're treating them like criminals in school, it shouldn't be surprising that we then treat them as criminals outside of school. So I take this issue very seriously. When my nephew was young, he was a freshman in high school. He's grown now, but he was accused of, he had engaged in some kind of play fight at school. They had a zero tolerance policy. And he was, you know, in the hallway with a kid walked by and they pretended that they were boxing and kept walking. That was caught on camera. Now, first of all, my nephew was in the hallway. He wasn't supposed to be, right? That was first problem. But they wanted to expel him because they had a zero tolerance policy for fighting. right? And don't get me wrong, I'm not a soft parent. If I get a call that my kid is fighting at school, my kid and I are going to have a problem, right? Depending on circumstances. But I went to talk to the principal, not because I thought that my nephew was blameless, but because I took issue with the fact that they wanted to expel him for fighting. He wasn't fighting. He was playing. He was someplace he wasn't where he wasn't supposed to be, but he wasn't fighting. And so I told them, I said, if you think that he was really being aggressive with that other child and he was fighting, then I will not take issue with your expulsion, but you will not expel him, right? If you are having zero tolerance from him playing around in the hallway with the kid. First of all, I thought it was an overreaction, but secondly, right, he gets expelled for fighting. That makes it twice as likely that he's going to be arrested while he's on forced leave from school, right? Less likely to complete high school, all of those things. You start to criminalize him now, right? That's going to follow him. I had a similar issue with my son. It didn't involve fighting. He was wrongfully accused of cheating on a test in school. And it turned out to be a misunderstanding, but I probably as soon as I saw that, like I jumped into action and I investigated and I figured it out before the teacher did, because I knew, right, that if somehow he ended up with some allegation of, even of, I don't know, cutting and pasting on an online exam, whatever it was, that was going to follow him, right? That was going to frame how that teacher saw him in the future. I mean, that was going to be on his record, so to speak. And so thank goodness we figured that out. But like I said, again, I probably overreacted because I was like, oh no, we can't start that now. Okay. African-American students are punished more often and more harshly for similar offenses. African-American first-time offenders are suspended at rates that are double or more than those for white offenders. And though we comprise about 18% of the preschool population, we comprise almost half of the preschool students that are suspended. Okay. I was reminded of, I spent some time with Grand Rapids has a couple of really wealthy families that are fantastic philanthropists, and, they have funded much of the arts and culture here in Grand Rapids, and, as well as other philanthropic endeavors. And I was having dinner with one of the younger people in their families, a kid in his 20s or 30s, and he was talking about the wonderful high school prank that he had pulled when he went to Christian High, that they had for their senior prank, they had in the middle of the night, right? So during school, they jimmied one of the windows and kind of propped it open, and then returned in the middle of the night to break into the school and take all the dongs out of the bells. Right? Absolutely hilarious. So when they came in the next day, they couldn't ring the bell, and the principal had to get on the speaker and say, "It is now time for second hour." Is that because they couldn't ring the bell, right? Hilarious. And so they couldn't figure out who did it. They were just flummoxed. They were like, we don't know how this happened. And the young men were so they were offended. They wanted their credit. They wanted to get caught because they wanted credit for this caper. And so they actually came forward and say, "Hey, it was us," right? And, everybody laughed, and it was, I don't know, maybe they had some minor consequence or something like that. And I remember I was hoping that my face did not betray what I was thinking, which is, can you imagine if my son had pulled that prank? Right? Can you imagine if my son had broken into the school in the middle of the night? Right? And so, it's just real, right? That, the Black offenders are treated differently than other people for lots of reasons we already talked about. Okay. And so how does school discipline affect our young people? Right? In part, it labels them. Right? After a while, if you keep being told who you are, even if it's not how you started out, right? It can become who you are if you're not careful. And I've heard people say, well, you know what? This is what they expect of me anyway. So people come to identify and behave in ways that reflect how other people label them. Sometimes you just get tired of fighting the label and you say, you know what, if you're going to treat me like a criminal anyway, and it may not be a conscious decision, right? But that's why it's so, so important from an early age, right? For us for kids to have varied role models and people in their lives that look like them as well as others, right? So they don't come to believe the labels, right? The negative labels that are put on them. They're removed from the safety and structure of school, right? So you suspend a kid, you kick a kid out of school. For some kids, for many kids, school is the most structured that they have, right? That teacher, even if they get that teacher grief, right? That teacher is one of the best role models that they have. And the time that they spend out of school is often not spent, right? Is often spent with other people that are also in trouble. Okay. It starts to paint our authority figures as unfair, untrustworthy, the enemy. When my son, for that, little 15-hour period that we were kind of trying to figure out what was happening with this cheating scandal or whatever, it was affected. It was his favorite teacher. This incident involved his favorite teacher. And he wanted to, can I drop the class? Like he just, he was afraid, first of all, that this teacher had now labeled him, right? And he thought he was being treated unfairly. And all of a sudden, his relationship with authority changes, right? Like, how do you relate to a teacher or to authority figure who believes that you did something wrong and you didn't, but you did it, you know what I mean? And you can't convince them otherwise. Like, how does that play out, right? And imagine it playing out over and over again. Right? So then you have the stigma of exclusion, depression, anger, confusion, resignation. So many of our kids just, remove themselves from that world. They think they don't belong and they just have a, oh, well, right, attitude about it. So, that's a lot of depressing, effects of lingering discrimination, et cetera. What in the world, what can we possibly do about it? And again, I'm excited to be in a room full of women who are doers, because I know that you guys are thinking deliberately about it. And these are just a couple of things that I came up with. And I know that, you all are doing this work day to day, right? And can think of other things as well. But first and foremost, we need to check our own biases and encourage conversations and arenas for others to do the same. So the fact that you are gathered here today for the purpose of talking through, I can't overstate, right? How that warms my heart. And I think that one of the things that's going on in America today, in our society today, is that we don't have spaces where we can do this. And we're discouraging spaces to do this, right? The administration just recently signed an executive order stating that basically outlawing implicit bias training and other, kind of related trainings in federal programs. And I had recently been asked to speak at the U.S. Attorney's Office on the issue of implicit bias. And the U.S. Attorney here he had to call me and say, you know what, it sounds like we're going to have to put that on the back burner, right? Which is really too bad. And too often, and the reasons why, those kind of trainings are being discouraged is because they often are seen to treat Black people as victims or white people as perpetrators in it, and supposedly they divide us and distort history, et cetera. But as we know, when done well, right, you do the exact opposite, right? Talking about white privilege is not an indictment of white people. It's not saying that white people are horrible because they have privilege. It is trying to, when I talk about white people, I'm not talking badly or criticizing my friends, right? Or the people that I'm talking about. I'm trying to get them to better understand me, right? I have a wonderful friend, my secretary. She's a white woman who lives in suburban Grand Rapids, and she has 2 sons, and one of them is a new Wolverine this year, which I love. And one time she told me, right, because she works for me, and she says, I try to understand the problems that African Americans face and the things that about which they protest, et cetera. She said, but I look at you and I say, this woman's a professor. This woman, my son plays soccer, and my daughter's on the honor roll. She said, and I say, well, if Tracey could do it, right? I don't understand what the problem is. Why can't other people do it? And of course, that gave us a whole window to talk about, right? Why, I could, I am in too many instances an exception as opposed to a rule in my community, and the how much my parents had to, scrape and fight, et cetera, to kind of get me where I am today, and the things that I still have to be concerned about, even as a middle class law professor, with respect to raising my son, that she'll never have to be concerned about. That she has other concerns. Don't get me wrong. Raising teenagers is raising teenagers, and so I don't, right. But there are things conversations that I have to have with my son that she'll never have about interactions with police, about how people label you, about, pride, et cetera, et cetera. And she, we had a great conversation about it, right? And again, it wasn't about bashing her. It was about, well, I want you to understand me. And if we can understand each other, if we can get to know one another better, right, then that will help our relationship going forward. But it's difficult to understand the African American community in general. Again, not to overgeneralize, but in general, it's hard to understand what I'm going through without also talking about discrimination, talking about racism, talking about privilege, because those are part of, you know, those dynamics are part of, you know, what formed me, right? And what formed us and our relationship to one another. Second thing we could do is we could support innovative efforts to provide safe, right, positive, encouraging, empowering education environments for all people. And so, you know, the last time I gave this presentation, there were a couple of people who worked in school systems in the room, and they were telling me about some of the efforts that they were making to shift the paradigm and to change the ways that they looked at discipline in their schools and their school systems. And it was really, really encouraging. And finally, just rethinking how we look at school discipline, the efficacy of removing children from learning environments as punishment, right? If we can move to a point where and again, this is just a spectrum, where we're thinking deliberately enough about the box that we're living in, a box in which African-American children are treated so differently than other children when it comes to discipline in the school system, right? Thinking about the implications of that, and then what can we do to change that? How should we be looking at school discipline? Right? Should we be looking at ways to keep kids in the classroom, right, as much as possible? Is it really necessary, right? Is it really even desirable to remove students from class, from school as punishment, unless you really think that they're a danger to others, right? Shouldn't they be in school? Shouldn't they be in that environment? Shouldn't we be trying to capture them and keep them safe? So we could shift that paradigm and stop thinking about our young kids, right, as animals or as criminals, right, or as ruffians, and start thinking about them as children who need our help, right, that might not have the same upbringing as we have, might not have the same privileges that we have, might not have the same resources that we have, and how can we help them achieve the goals that they have? And so finally, I'll say I'm part of an organization called Jack and Jill, which is a national mothers group that was founded in 1938 by a couple of Black women who, you know, you can think back to what was happening in 1938, desired that their children have the same opportunities, right, as other children. So, you know, Jack and Jill is obviously we talk about these issues, but we're also kind of an arts and culture organization where we get together every week. Our kids are in groups where they do leadership activities and cultural activities, and they learn about African-American history, and, you know, they meet Black doctors and engineers and playwrights and all of those things. And the idea, right, is to expose them to the world, right? The world beyond the images that they see of themselves on TV, or, you know, right, you know, so that they could think deeply about George Floyd and the things that led up to that, right? But also know that hopefully that won't be the only thing that frames their lives, that they can live a life and they can have the same opportunities that all children do. And that's really what, right, we want. So when we talk about, you know, so people even say sometimes, what's the point of an African-American mothers group? And, you know, this, that, and others. So you're further separating yourself. And again, couldn't be farther from the truth, right? It's just giving us a space to remind our kids that they have the same opportunity, the same talent, the same treasure, right? The same support as all kids do. And that really, at the end of the day, right, is what we want to give all children. Okay. And so, you know, as I leave you this morning, I just ask you to think about, you know, again, what is your role in ebbing the school to prison pipeline? And again, it could be, you know, varied. It starts with having conversations like these. You know, I know that you all are doing hard work in many areas. Stop my share. So I continue that hard work. And with that, I said that concludes all that I had to say. And again, I just thank you so much for having me here this morning and for listening to what I had to say.
Okay.
Everybody show appreciation. That was great.
Thank you so much. And I saw a couple of questions in the chat, and somebody asked what I meant by preschool. And yeah, I meant younger than 5. Yeah, and the statistic is scary and sad. But again, you know, you guys now know how to reach me. And like I said, I love this group. So if you do other things, let me know, because I might come. I think you guys are awesome.